Every once in a while I do screw up. In fact, I screw up a lot. In fact, you guys should screw up a lot too because you learn from it. Oh, yeah. That is, Oops.
That would have been straight into my back.
Very bad. All right, so we talked about the brain. We're still talking about the nervous system. So now we want to move into the spinal cord, okay, and what the spinal cord does. We know at this point that it serves as a conduit up and down, right, from brain down or higher, brain down to peripheral nervous system, from peripheral nervous system up to the brain. All right, these would be called ascending pathways. These would be called descending pathways. These would be called afferent pathways. These would be called efferent pathways. These would be called sensory pathways. These would be called motor pathways. All right, so going up and down the spinal cord, you have several ways in which we can describe the tracks that are going up and down. All right, everything on the left would mean the same thing. Everything on the right would mean the same thing as each other. All right? But one of the things we mentioned in the brain lecture is that the spinal cord is not just a conduit, right? It has its own built-in circuits that supply reflexes, all right, that do not need brain intervention. All right, so we call those reflex arcs. All right, and the simplest way to put it is receptor, something detects something in the environment, goes to the spinal cord, and then comes out to an effector to have some sort of response. All right, they're automatic. They don't need conscious control, and we don't have to think about them. All right. Their purpose is to keep us out of danger, right? They keep us out of danger and keep us alive. If we didn't have these reflexes, for example, like remember we said Nick was hot and we tried to touch him and we don't want him to burn us, so we pull away. That is a automatic reflex. I didn't have to think about it to pull my arm away. All right, and these are just some other examples of reflexes just to give you a flavor. So what you do have to know is the parts of a reflex arc. All right, and there are 5 general parts. Actually, it's a little more complicated than what we're presenting, but these are the 5 parts. First, you have to have a receptor. All right, that receptor could be a touch receptor, a pain receptor, a temperature receptor in our skin. All right, and we'll talk about all those sensory receptors next week when we start the sensory system. It could be a stretch receptor in our stomach. You remember that enterogastric reflex? Not in our stomach, but in our small intestine. Small intestine stretches, sends signals to the spinal cord. Spinal cord sends signals back to the stomach to stop pressing. All right, those are all examples of receptors that are detecting some change in the environment. All right, once they're detected, those receptors are actually the dendrites, modified dendrites of a sensory neuron. All right, your sensory neuron. And your sensory neuron is going to come out from the skin, go into the dorsal root of a spinal nerve. All right, and you always know that it's a dorsal root because the dorsal root has these ganglion on it. And I think we learned this in anatomy, one of your lectures. I don't remember when exactly it was. But the dorsal root ganglion houses all of the cell bodies for the sensory neurons. So you'll know it's dorsal, you know it's sensory if it's got that swelling, that ganglion. And then they go in through the back side. All right, all sensory information goes in dorsally. All right, that's really important to remember. Every sensory goes in dorsally through the back of the spinal cord. All right, and then it will make a synapse within the gray matter. All right, now here's the tricky part of reflex arcs. Sometimes it makes a synapse directly with the motor neuron. So we have sensory, synapse, motor. Since there's only one synapse in a way, we refer to those as monosynaptic reflexes. All right, I'm mentioning this because this term is going to come up a few times today, and I want to make sure you understand what it means. All right, so sometimes sensory directly connects to motor. That's a monosynaptic reflex. More often than not, though, we have within the gray matter, which is part 3, an interneuron. All right, by definition, interneuron is what? In between. It's in between sensory and motor. Now, the interneurons are interesting because, one, they will connect the sensory to the motor. All right, so we haven't gotten to that part yet. They will connect the sensory to the motor and act as an in-between for them. All right? Since, using this example, there are 2 synapses, what kind of reflex would we call that? Disynaptic. All right? Could you also have trisynaptic, so on? All right, so anytime you have multiple synapses within the gray matter of the spinal cord, we're going to describe them by the number that are there. All right? But the real usefulness of the interneuron is to either communicate with the other side, so it'll send branches that go to the other side of the spinal cord, and or it will send afferent fibers up to the brain. All right, so that's the purpose of the interneurons, to connect sensory to motor, connect one side of the spinal cord to the other, and to be able to send relay signals up to the brain. Why would you? All right, let's use our hot example again. We don't want to burn ourselves. It doesn't take me thinking to pull my hand back, but I might have an interneuron that's going up to my brain. Why would I need that?
Memory.
Okay, what do you mean? Who said that?
Don't do it again.
So you don't do it again. You learn from it, right? Your spinal cord can't learn, but it can send signals up to your brain. It does learn, say, oh, if I ever see Nick again, I don't want to touch him because he's hot as hell. Okay, so good, learning. Okay, 4, coming out, you have the motor neuron. So that's motor's always going to come out the anterior or ventral side. All right, motor always comes out the anterior or ventral side. All right, so you're going to send that out. And then the final part, number 5, is going to be your effector. Now, most effectors in your body are going to be muscular. All right, if we use that burn example again, I want to tell my muscles to move away so they don't get hurt. But they can also be a gland. All right, they can also be a gland. But we're going to use the examples of muscles. So those are the basic parts. Definitely know a reflex arc. If you don't understand it, draw it out. If you don't want to draw it out, try to do it from memory. If you can't do it from memory, you don't know it well enough, look at it again. Okay?
So the previous example made sense with the interneuron sending it to the motor and also to the brain to learn. What are the examples of you not needing to learn from a reflex? want to know that that's dangerous and to not do it again? Or like, do you know what I'm trying to say?
We'll
Okay.
we'll use an example.
Okay.
Okay, there is an example of that. A lot to be short right now. Proprioception, your ability to maintain balance.
Oh.
You don't have to think to do that, and you don't learn how to balance. Your body will automatically do that. All right. So we know that sensory comes in through the back. We know their job is to stimulate motor responses. All right, but there's two types within muscle, and this is why we're talking about muscles. There are 1A sensory fibers, 1A, and those are associated with muscle spindles in the middle of our muscle. So we have these, we have our muscle, which is this right here. All of the part that we usually consider muscle, the stuff that we see in that leg and that arm that's in the anatomy lab, those are all what we call extrafusal muscle fibers, the bulk of our muscle. Embedded within the extrafusal muscle fibers are intrafusal muscle fibers that contain this muscle spindle. And we talked about the muscle spindle when we did muscle last time, right? We talked about the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. All right? So this muscle spindle, again, remember, it responds to stretch. And it will contract the muscle in response to stretch to avoid overstretching. And we'll go into the example of that, and that actually is what relates to the not having to go up to the brain to have memory. The other type are 1B neurons, sensory neurons. Those are going to come from the Golgi tendon organs. Okay, so 1A comes from the spindle, 1B comes from the Golgi tendon organ. And remember, the Golgi tendon organ responds to tension and will relax the muscle as a response. All right, we're not going to get into the specifics of how that works, but we're going to focus more on the muscle spindle in a couple minutes. All right, that's sensory. We talked about this interneuron. We talked about the fact that it goes up and down. Those are ascending, descending fibers. But then the motor neurons that come out always come out the anterior portion. There are two types that I want you to know. One are the alpha motor neurons. Those are the big ones. Those go to those extrafusal fibers. They're the ones that we consider to be the motor neuron that contracts the muscle. Alpha motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons go to these intrafusal fibers, these muscle spindles. And we'll talk about why that is once we go over the specific reflex to show how this works. All right, so keep that in check for a minute. Interneurons, notice that they are way more abundant than your motor neurons because we want to have levels of control. So when we say that the central nervous system, including the spinal cord, processes information, it does that by sending signals to the appropriate places they need to go. And remember, we said that is the job of interneurons. So if we have a sensory neuron coming in here, we see that it can directly connect to a motor neuron, but it can also connect to a multitude of interneurons within here. So that's the point of showing this picture, is that there's so many interneurons that do multiple things, even in one reflex pathway. All right, review really quick. The cortical spinal tract, remember that comes from the primary motor cortex, heads down into the medulla. What does it do in the medulla? Crosses over, it decussates, right? So that the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body and vice versa. All right, so just a reminder of what that is. All right, so the cortical spinal tract typically comes down. Here's an interneuron. Here's an interneuron. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Here's your cortical spinal tract. That's this part in yellow right here. Synapses onto an interneuron. Then onto another interneuron. Then onto another interneuron, which then goes and synapses onto a motor pathway. So it's not as straightforward as just coming down and going directly out to a motor neuron. You always have a bunch of interneurons in a way that will finely tune that muscle control. Okay, so we're not going into the specifics of what kind of interneurons or what kind of responses you're going to get, but recognize that it's not just a simple down and out. All right. In terms of the motor neurons, remember we have our upper motor neurons. That is contained entirely within the what? Spinal cord. Motor neurons are contained entirely within, well, all right, correction, central nervous system. Contained entirely within the CNS. All right, they're going to go down and they're going to synapse within the spinal cord. Again, multiple interneurons involved. Those are upper motor neurons. Lower motor neurons are those motor neurons that are going to come out of the anterior portion of the spinal cord. All right, and again, there's two types. You have the alpha motor neurons. Those are going to go to the bulk of the muscle, those extrafusal fibers. Those are what's going to generate our forceful contractions. So our ability to do work, pick up this big-ass water bottle right here, for example. The gamma motor neurons, remember, they go to the muscle spindle, those intrafusal muscle fibers. They are responsible for the reflex contractions. All right, and we'll talk about how that works. So if you want to think about a muscle working, if I want to say, all right, I want to lift up this table, so I've got to recruit the muscles that are going to do that, that's all coming from alpha motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons are coming as a reflex arc from the muscle spindle saying, all right, this is too heavy for me to pick up. I'm going to prevent damage to my muscle. Okay? So that's the function of these gamma motor neurons. All right? Same stuff we've already just said. So this is just another picture showing it. All right, so let's talk about that stretch reflex now. So this is one of the few reflexes in your body that don't require any central nervous system intervention and will just allow you to avoid danger. So we have a sudden stretch of a muscle. All right, a good example to use, there's two examples we can use. You're either standing here and somebody drops a box on your arms and that's going to stretch your muscle and you've got to respond. So that's a reflex contraction, right? Or your wife's like, hey, catch me. Right? And you don't want to drop her, so you've got to contract your muscles. All right, this is that stretch reflex. The other one is, I'm not going to do it. I used to do this, but if I get up on that table and jump down, generally speaking, should I fall over? No, because when I jump down, I stretch my tendon, my patellar tendon. That sends signals to my spinal cord back to my muscles to contract the muscles so that I don't fall down, so that I balance myself. Okay? That's what this stretch reflex does. And when you do that, you don't have to remember to do that. You don't need your brain to do that, so this is your answer. It's going to happen automatically. All right? All right. However, let's use my wife example. She never did this, thank God. She jumps into my arms. Why are we laughing? My arms start going down, I stretch. I'm going to start, what muscles am I going to contract to lift her back up? Biceps would be one of them. So I'm going to lift her back up, right? But if I'm lifting her back up, do I want these muscles, the triceps, to be activated? No, because they're going to oppose me lifting. So not only are you stimulating your synergistic muscles, the ones you want to do the work to contract, but you're inhibiting antagonistic muscles. All right, you have to inhibit those antagonistic muscles so that they don't contract at the same time. Because if she jumps in my arms and I contract both sets of muscles, she's sliding right off onto the ground, and then I'm in trouble for a few weeks. The fact that this is a monosynaptic reflex tells you what? Pardon? There's no interneuron, and therefore there's no conscious intervention. Okay? No conscious intervention. All right, so let's use another example, the patellar reflex, your knee jerk. Why do you sit up on a doctor's table and they whack your knee with a hammer? Right? Okay, you don't have that reflex just so that they can test your reflexes. That's not why it was evolutionary put in. All right? So you strike the patellar tendon right here. That's going to stretch that spindle fiber in your quadriceps muscles. All right? Are you displacing that tendon very much? No. So are you stretching that muscle spindle very far? No. But it's going to respond anyway, so it doesn't take much, is the point. It doesn't take much to stimulate these. All right, so your muscle spindle stretches in your quadriceps. That's going to send signals up through the back of your spinal cord, okay? And what type of sensory fiber is that that's going up? The one that's attached to the muscle? Which type was that? No. We gave them numbers and letters. 1A.
Which term are we talking?
Could be a lot of terms. All right. So it's going to go up. Actually, it says it right there, 1A. Okay? It can directly attach to a motor neuron, innervate those extrafusal muscle fibers to contract. And what happens to your leg? Boop. Right? Kicks out. Right? That's a simple reflex. But what do you notice about this other branch right here? What's it doing? No. Well, it is inhibiting, but how is it inhibiting? How's it? Interneurons. Good. There's an interneuron right there in between that's then going to go to the opposing muscle group. And what's the opposing muscle group to your quadriceps? Your hamstrings. Your... Come on, you just had a test on this. Not today. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. All right, and it's going to. You guys are like, "Fuck you, I'm dead." It's going to tell those muscles to relax, because what do you want to do? You want to kick out. You don't want anything to oppose that. So, even though it is a monosynaptic reflex to contract these muscles, it's also an inhibitory reflex through an interneuron to make sure that the opposing muscles are relaxed. All right? Those are all occurring through alpha motor neurons, right? The big ones going down. You will also have, and it's not listed here, let's do it this way. Here's your muscle. Actually, here's your muscle. Here's your muscle when it's contracted, all right? When you stretch that intrafusal muscle fiber, but you contract the muscle, it's still going to be stretched out, right? And if it's stretched out, it's not going to be sending signals anymore. So what happens with these gamma motor neurons, the ones that go to the muscle spindle, is it will shorten this one as well, so it shortens with the muscle fiber so that you can still maintain that level of control. All right, so that's the point of the gamma motor neurons, going to these intrafusal muscle fibers to shorten with the extrafusal muscle fibers. Okay, and that's all we're going to talk about that one. All right, I just want to make sure you understand what the gammas are doing as well. Okay. Why do we test the patellar tendon? This video will show you why. I feel like Daniel now.
Next video, please.
Is that what he says? Next video, please?
Yes.
Oh, my God. I mean,
And he's not even looking at us. He's looking at the screen. Next video, please.
I mean, you got to love him, right?
He also yells smegma. You can't just say it in a normal smegma.
So do you ever wonder why he does that, but then he's afraid to do, like,
Yes.
other things?
Yes.
I can't figure it out.
He told me an off-color Helen Keller joke the other day, and I'm like, damn. All right, so here's the video. This guy's assessing someone who has Alzheimer's, I believe. Okay, so watch his response.
The patellar tendon extends from below the patella, which is right here. It's a broad band of tissue. It's easily accountable. If you're not sure where it is, have the patient extend their leg, which will cause the tendon to shorten. And you can strike directly on the tendon. And those reflexes are very brisk. And in fact, there are a few extra beats in movement, which are referred to as clones. Again, classic for upper motor neuron syndrome. In cases like this, the reflex can be elicited by simply tapping on the tendon often. You see, the same reflex requires very little stimulus. Compared again with the normal side, the patella tendon, again extending from below the patella. Strike on the tendon. So that would be that normal reflex, and certainly diminished compared with the stuff that's hyperreflex.
All right, so upper motor neuron disease, right, caused that hyperreflexia, that hyper response that he had. And so those are, and then you had the clonus, which was like the jerkiness of it. So those are the kind of things you're looking for when you do a patellar reflex. Like most of your patients, you're going to see absolutely normal. When you see something like that, you're like, don't do that, right? You want to be, you want to be a good clinician. You want to go, okay. walk out of the room and go to your nurse. Oh my God. So anyway, that's what the knee-jerk reflex is, and one of the reasons why you're looking for it in terms of upper motor neuron disease and what you might experience, okay? All right. So, did I?
Yeah. Or you.
Nope, there we go. All right. It's not as simple as this ever, right? And I'm not going to have you go all through this pathway, but I want you to understand that let's say I go, let's use this example. He's stepping on a broken bottle. If I go to step on a broken bottle, it's going to hurt my left foot, right? And what am I going to do? I'm going to pull back. But what am I not doing? Falling down, right? So you're going to have to send signals to the other leg that go back and forth and maintain that balance while you are pulling away from that dangerous or that potentially harmful thing. All right. So what we call that is the flexor withdrawal reflex. All right. And if you notice, you have these sensory neurons coming up to the spinal cord. You have at least 4 different branches going on here. Right? You have one branch that's going to your hamstrings to help you withdraw. Right? You have another one inhibiting your quadriceps so that you don't oppose that contraction. So that's all happening in this leg. But then you have interneurons that cross to the other side that tell your other leg to do this back and forth so you don't fall. All right? You like my dance? Oh, yeah. Sorry. He was looking at me like, do I tell him? Do I not tell him? All right, so that is kind of highlighting big time why you need those extra interneurons, so that, and why you would want to cross over, because not everything is just going to be as simple as touching and pulling your arm away. You're going to have to maintain balance because you don't want to hurt your foot, but you also don't want to fall off a cliff. All right. The fact that you crossed over and affected the other side as well. Back up. Withdrawing my foot is the flexor withdrawal reflex. Crossing over and preventing myself from falling down is your crossed extensor reflex. Because you're crossed over and you are contracting muscles to maintain balance. All right. Notice that we call this polysynaptic. All right. Once you get above a certain threshold, like you stop calling it, you don't want a decasynaptic response. It's just polysynaptic. All right. So this picture really is just showing you the complexity of this response. Notice you have one sensory coming in, a bunch of different interneurons going to the leg that is, or actually this is an arm, the arm that is withdrawing, but another one that is going to be preventing you from falling. So let's say the example of this is you fall, your hand falls on a broken bottle, and then you pull away, but you don't fall down with your face on that broken bottle. So the other arm's got to be stimulated too. Okay, I know that's a really bad example, and that would almost never happen, but that's how it works. All right. Other reflexes. You have the fact that you stand here like this without leaning forward or backward and very little swaying back and forth is a result of these types of reflexes. So what actually stimulates the crossed extensor reflex is actually pressure on your foot. It's not just pulling away. It's pressure that happened on this foot that elicited that cross extensor reflex. Basic walking reflexes. Remember I said if you cut off your head while you're walking, you're still going to take a few steps because the pressure in your foot basically told you that you need to extend your leg, and you take a step, and then you take another step. That's all happening at the level of the spinal cord. And it's fascinating stuff, but things we don't have time to get into. All right, I already showed you this picture, so I'm not going to go into it. Then we have cranial nerves. You're like, yay. Cranial nerves, what they do, where they're located. We'll put it this way. Knowing where your cranial nerves are and how you test them is an anatomy thing. Knowing what your cranial nerves are and what they do is a physiology thing. Okay? So make sure you're aware of all the cranial nerves and what they do. A lot of them tell you exactly what they do. Olfactory, smelling, optic, seeing, oculomotor, abducens, and trochlear, eye movement. Okay? Glossopharyngeal, tongue and pharynx. So what would be a thing that regulates? Swallowing would be a really good one. Okay? So make sure you're aware of those. So I put a summary of them on here. The mnemonic that I use, which you guys, I get it. It's boring. It sucks. It's like an old man thing. I'm an old man. All right. What?
They're judging that one, it sounds like.
Yeah. I'm glad it works for you.
Well, it's one of those. I've tried other ones, and I'm like, I can't get this one out of my head because it's been stamped. So, to touch and feel, whatever.
You're also getting critique from the youngest person in the class right now, so take that one.
So, anyway. All right, so have a good sense of what the cranial nerves are and what they do. All right. What they do will also tell you, really, I'm not going to say which one's sensory, which one's motor, which one's both, but what they do will tell you if they're sensory, motor, or both. Like if one of them results, for example, facial relates to taste, is that sensory or motor? Sensory. You guys thought a little too long about that one. Okay. All right, and finally, I think these are the last two slides. Autonomic control in the CNS. All right. When we think of autonomic, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Automatic. As I was hoping. Some of you probably thought sympathetic, parasympathetic. Yes, those should come into your mind too, but autonomic is automatic. All right. So do you have to think about any of that? No. So does it come from your cerebral cortex? No. But does it come from the brain? Yes. All right. So we're talking about everything from the diencephalon down that's related to the autonomic nervous system. All right. So it is controlled by your brain, but not higher brain centers. All right. And these are just some examples, and we've gone through a lot of these already, of autonomic control. Water balance, ADH, signals from the kidney. Feeding control, which we didn't talk about. It's actually on your IOs, but like I skipped right by those. Urinary bladder control, the respiratory center, vasomotor center, all of those autonomic responses. Okay, so realize that they are coming from diencephalon below, and you don't have to think about them for them to have an action. All right, just a quick review. When we're talking about autonomic, we're talking about sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Sympathetic we know is what? In terms of what kind of response does it give you? Fight or flight. Okay, what about parasympathetic? Rest and digest. All right, so if I were to ask you questions like, which system speeds up heart rate? Sympathetic. Which one slows down heart rate? Parasympathetic. Which one increases vasoconstriction? What decreases vasoconstriction? Sweet. Less sympathetic. Remember, blood vessels do not have parasympathetic. All right, so things like that. All right. Other examples with the eye, sympathetic. Think about fight or flight. In fact, I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday. When you are in a mode where you want to be like all on, right? What do you want to happen? You want to get blood and energy to tissues, right? And you want to be able to see. You want to be able to breathe and get that oxygen in.